From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Well, good morning. Good morning on this very rainy day, alas. And welcome to the History and Biography stage of this year's National Book Festival. We're delighted to see all of you here and want to extend a special welcome to those who are watching us live on C-SPAN. I'm Jane McAuliffe, Director of National and International Outreach at the Library of Congress. And all of us at the library are proud to host, once again, this free public event which brings together many of our country's favorite authors. We're especially grateful to the many sponsors who make this festival possible. And we're thrilled that the library has been able to hold this festival for 17 years. The library is thriving because of people like you, library patrons and book lovers, who not only enjoy reading, but recognize the value that literature has for our society. Now, the history and biography stage has been a perennial favorite here at the Book Festival. Today, we have a terrific lineup of authors on this stage, a dozen in all, and many of them are making their first Book Festival appearance. Two of the authors, however, A. Scott Berg and John Farrell, have been with us before, and we are so pleased that they're coming back for a return appearance this year. As an additional bonus, all of the authors here at the History and Biography Pavilion will be signing their books right after their presentations downstairs on the expo floor. We begin today with a panel discussion marking the 100th anniversary of John F. Kennedy's birth. Three authors, Steven Levingston, Kathy McKeon, and Thomas Oliphant, will talk about their recent books on this fascinating 35th president, his family, his campaign, and his role in the civil rights effort. I'm sure this will be an informational as well as inspiring discussion. But before we get started, I want to give a special thanks to Wells Fargo, which has generously sponsored the History and Biography stage here at the festival for 7 years now. Wells Fargo Regional President Michael Golden is here with us today and would like to say a few words. Mike?
Thank you. As Louise said, I'm Mike Golden. I serve as regional president for our operation here in the Capital Region, and it's my pleasure to have been here all 7 years. My family and I relocated to the Greater Washington market almost 7 years ago now, and this was the very first event that I had the pleasure of attending publicly after we moved here from Atlanta, Georgia. So it's been a real pleasure to be a part of this festival for 7 years. Our company, Wells Fargo, is extremely proud to have been a charter sponsor of the National Book Festival and also the sponsor of the stage for all 7 years. You know, we celebrate the wonderful work that the Library of Congress does in promoting literacy and active reading, because Wells Fargo's had an active role of promoting literacy across our country for a quite long time. Here locally in the Greater Washington market, last year we had our team members read to more than 110,000 students in different school systems in this great market, and we donated over 61,000 books in our Reading First program. And downstairs you will find Wells Fargo team members working in two different pavilions with a number of fun activities. That's Let's Read America Pavilion, as well as the Hands-on History Pavilion. So I hope you'll take some time to stop by there. But now it's my pleasure to welcome Mary Louise Kelly of the National Public Radio, who will now moderate our panel. Thank you very much.
Good morning. Can you all hear me? Excellent. That's a good start. I'm going to lay 4 dates on you. John Fitzgerald Kennedy was born 100 years ago this year, May 29th, 1917. He was married September 12th, 1953. Elected president, took the oath of office January 20th, 1961, and of course died November 22nd, 1963 in Dallas at the age of 46. And I start with those dates because they're so well known. The arc of his life is so well known. So many books have already been written about him. And yet, as evidenced by the trio of authors on stage with us today, there is still so much curiosity about that extraordinary life. So it's a privilege to get to kick off the book festival by talking about that extraordinary life for a few minutes with you all, and maybe asking what lessons from that life might apply to today's interesting times. So welcome to each of the three of you. Tom Oliphant, Kathy McKeon, Steve Levingston. Welcome to you all. I thought we would start by letting each of you share a little bit of the particular vantage point that you bring and what ground your book covers. And I know you've each brought a few pictures we can share to give you a little bit of a taste of some of this new literature and scholarship coming out on Kennedy. So we're going to go, I guess, in the order we're seated. Tom Oliphant, that means you get the first word. With your book, The Road to Camelot, inside JFK's 5-year campaign. And your book, I know, is about his rise to the White House and how close he came to losing. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about that. I'm going to let you just briefly talk us through some of the pictures you brought to share. So we'll go to this first one and just tell us a little bit about the perspective that you bring.
That picture is of what they call in politics a boiler room. It's actually the sun porch of Bob Kennedy's house in Hyannisport. Okay. And it is shortly after dawn, after the election. Kennedy at that point knows that he is going to be the president-elect. But there are still a lot of states in play, and this was one of those election nights that was an all-nighter. Kennedy didn't go to bed until around 3 for a short nap. And in those days, the first sign that you'd been elected president was the appearance of Secret Service agents.
Aha, they showed up and you knew you were in good shape.
Around dawn, and it was when he woke up in his house in the compound, he noticed the agents, and that was the first clue to him that this had happened. While he was sleeping, the last thing I'll say, on election night, the state that in the public's mind and in journalism's coverage that tipped this thing, that made it pretty clear that he was going to be the next president, was Minnesota, which went back and forth all through the night and didn't fall over into his column until shortly before dawn. And the wise guys in that room and the one just to the left at that point knew that they had, as one put it, fallen over the finish line.
Okay. All right. We're going to quickly flip through a few of the others you brought. Stop me if you want, or just tell us what we're seeing. Why'd you pick this one?
That's a look at this guy right at the beginning of the whole process. Our mentor in this kind of work, Theodore White, in The Making of the President, 1960, wrote a story of a year-plus campaign. What Curtis Wilkie and I discovered in our research was that this process was actually 5 years of conscious pursuit of national office. Okay. And it started in the late summer of 1955, and that's what John Kennedy looked like then. You can still see a trace of the skinny kid after the war.
Yeah.
By the end of 1956, when he made the decision to actually run for president, he had filled out. But that's what he looked like when this all began. Everybody remembers the Rackets Committee, as we called it in journalism. It was a Senate investigation of corruption in the labor movement that focused primarily on the Teamsters Union and introduced the country for the first time to the guy in the middle, Bob Kennedy. and to the evil figures in the Teamsters Union back then. First, a guy named...
what's the date on this photo?
This would be in the summer of 1957.
57, all right.
And he'd already decided to run. His principal antagonist on the left was Eleanor Roosevelt, shown here. She nipped at his heels for at least 3 years, a little longer. She didn't trust him and she didn't like him, mostly because of his behavior during the heyday of Senator Joseph McCarthy. But she changed, as Kennedy did. And by this moment, when he was nominated for president, you see Sam Rayburn moderating a quote debate, which really wasn't much of one, before the Texas delegation and a few hangers-on from Massachusetts at the Democratic Convention in Los Angeles. Johnson, of course, and Kennedy are shown there. This is 2 days before he was actually nominated.
All right. Thank you so much. Kathy, we're going to come to you and let you give a little preview of your book, Jackie's Girl, My Life with the Kennedy Family. For those of you who haven't had the chance to read this delightful book yet, it is Kathy's story of her time working for Jacqueline Kennedy and as her personal assistant, living with the Kennedy family for 13 years and sometimes nannying to the kids. And Jackie's Girl was what Rose Kennedy called you, is that right?
Yes, yes,
The nickname?
yes.
Okay. So let's go through your pictures and you can tell us.
This was at my wedding in 71, and it was in Astoria Manor in New York. And I sent John and Caroline, and I called up Jackie, I called up Madame, an invitation, and Mr. Onassis. And they all sent
Hang on one second. Can y'all hear Kathy okay? Kathy, maybe take your mic and just hold it a little bit closer to your mouth because I want to make sure we
Like
can
that?
hear your stories. You might need to unpin it. Sometimes on dresses, they don't get close. You can unpin it. Tom, can you help her so she can just hold it a little closer?
I'm good for something.
Hold it like this.
Hold it up.
So I sent them all an invitation, and they all sent it back saying they were coming. And I was really a little nervous about this whole thing because I didn't want my guests to be crowded them, and I want them to have a good time. So I was very proud that she came to my wedding.
Of course, it's lovely.
Yes, and that's the picture of my wedding.
All right.
This picture was up in Cape Cod.
Hold it just a little pointing toward your mouth. Sorry, I just want to make
Like
sure
that.
everybody can
This
hear you.
picture was taken in Cape Cod. John,
Cape Cod, okay.
Yeah, John and Madame riding the horse. John wasn't a big favorite of horses, but that was Caroline's little pony, and then she outgrew the pony, and John was riding it then.
Okay.
But he got a
And here we are. He's younger there, it looks like.
This picture is in Newport, Rhode Island. It was called the Windmill House, and John is eating cupcakes, and the dog is there begging. And Madame is figuring out, should I have one of those cupcakes or not? But I don't know if she had one, but she was looking at them. This was the first summer in Cape Cod on the Kennedy Beach, and was in '65. And me and John had a little shovel with us, and we dug a hole, and we decided to bury Shannon. So. And he actually loved it because it was nice and cool in there, in the sand. And then after that, when that was finished, John decided he'd take Shannon down to the ocean and wash him off.
Aww.
This picture was in Colorado. For me to go to Colorado, Madame sent me to Bloomingdale's to get all my skiing clothes. I had no skiing clothes. I didn't know how to ski, and I had no skiing clothes. So she told me to go and meet this lady in Bloomingdale's, and I did. She gave me the credit card, and off I went, and I got all my clothes there, and I got myself a pair of gloves. The Secret Service guy didn't have a pair of gloves. He borrowed my gloves, but he never gave them back. Yeah.
And Kathy, would you just tell the story of the day you met the Kennedy family? As I said, you were 19 years old, you just arrived from Ireland to New York, you're looking for work as a domestic servant, and you get this summons to Park Avenue. What happened?
Oh yeah, I was only 19 years old. I had a job as taking care of 2 boys, but then my cousin was working outside of 1040, and he was a New York City police officer, and he got very close with one of the Secret Service men. And the Secret Service man said, Jackie Kennedy's looking for a nice Irish girl. You think you would take the job? And I said, sure, I'll take the job. But I said, I have another job. But they said, okay, she's looking for somebody. And I decided I'd take the job. I went up to the 15th floor on the elevator, and I rang the doorbell, and a lady let me in. And then I met John, and John came down the hall, and he says to me, my name is John. And I said, my name is Kathy. And he says to me, do you want to see my dog doing a trick? And I said, sure. And he said, okay, Shannon. He put the bone underneath the cushion, beautiful silk green cushion on the couch. And he said, go, Shannon. So Shannon went digging away to get the bone, and he got it. Oh, do you want to see him do another trick? And I said, yeah. And then he made Shannon roll over. And all of a sudden, this nice, soft voice came down the hallway. And she says, John, what are you doing? You're ruining my couch, right? And all of a sudden, John disappeared. And then he took off so fast. So then she says, I'm Mrs. Kennedy. And I said, my name is Kathy. And she said, I know that. And then she said, she was just looked at me for a little while. And then she says, when can you start? Oh. And I said, well, I have a job already, Mrs. Kennedy. But she said, oh, do you think you could start tomorrow? And I said, well, I have to let this other lady know that I'm leaving, you know. And I said, then I have to get a reference. And she says to me, you don't need no reference. You already got the reference. So actually, John and his dog interviewed me. Because she was listening in the hallway of the whole story. Yeah.
That is hard to top as job interview stories go.
Yeah.
Steve Levingston, let's get to yours. Kennedy and King, the president, the pastor, and the battle over civil rights. So you chose to do the story together, tying together Kennedy's life, King's life, this fascinating interaction of these two men who were at the forefront of the civil rights movement in the early 60s. Talk us through some of the slides you've brought. What are we seeing here?
Well, my book is basically the story of the relationship, a complicated relationship between John Kennedy and Martin Luther King. And it focuses on Martin Luther King's influence on John Kennedy in pushing him to become what is arguably the first civil rights president. But there's a big but there. When John Kennedy first came into office, he was not a civil rights advocate. He was rather opposed to pushing forward on civil rights because it took away from his domestic agenda and other foreign affairs that he wanted to focus on. So Martin Luther King really had to push him. And these photos will sort of show you the arc of the evolution of John Kennedy. The first one is from the 1961 Freedom Rides, which probably most of us remember here. This is when white supremacists and racists bombed one of the buses that was trying to bring down segregation in interstate travel and tried to trap those Freedom Riders inside. They finally managed to break out, but this was one of the early horrible incidents that Kennedy really didn't pay that much attention to. He didn't really come out strongly on really the moral issue that was involved in civil rights, and that's what always drove Martin Luther King forward. Now we jump forward to the Birmingham Campaign in 1963. There were other issues before this, but this is a significant one because it really did change the view of Kennedy as he was stumbling and dithering along. This is a photo of the Children's March, which King agreed to do reluctantly because he was a little afraid of throwing children into the protests for fear of them getting hurt. But he knew that what they were working for was the future of these children, and the children wanted to do it. So they went forward. But here's some of the reaction. The police and the fire department somewhat reluctantly under the police orders used high-powered water cannons knocking children and others to the ground. These fire hoses were so powerful that they tore the clothes off of the protesters and lacerated their skin. And the police, under the really aggressive police chief, Bull Connor, brought out these police dogs who...
This is the same day, Steve?
This is around the same time during the protests in Birmingham, which spread out over a period of time. They brought out the police dogs who were rather vicious and attacked people. Here, these next two photos will show you the difference in the life between Martin Luther King Jr. and John Kennedy during this time. This is Easter weekend in 1963 during the protests in Birmingham. Martin Luther King is being arrested and carted off to jail there with his friend Reverend Ralph Abernathy. And it was in jail that he wrote this tremendous piece called The Letter from Birmingham, where he outlined really the principles of the civil rights movement and a defense of civil disobedience. And it was a beautiful piece of work. Here, on that same weekend, is John Kennedy with his beautiful children and beautiful wife going to church, celebrating the Easter Sunday. This is at his father's estate in Palm Beach. Quite a contrast between these two men who were very different, and that was one of the reasons there was such difficulty in the two of them coming to an agreement on what needed to be done for America. This was almost, you could say, the event that pushed Kennedy over the edge. This was on June 11th, 1963, when the governor of Alabama, George Wallace, standing there, was blocking the schoolhouse door in the University of Alabama to prevent two black students from registering. Kennedy federalized the National Guard in that city and was appalled not only by this, but by all the other things that had occurred, and in a sense, had an epiphany. And on that very night of June 11th, 1963, we can go to the next photo, and we'll see John Kennedy was eager to go on television live. He didn't even have a speech really prepared. He cobbled something together with some of his staff, and he announced that he wanted to introduce civil rights legislation, which unfortunately he wasn't able to see through. Lyndon Johnson had to follow that through after Kennedy's assassination. But more importantly for Martin Luther King, this was really the first time that a president of the United States spoke about the civil rights movement in moral terms. He defined that this was a moral crisis in America that had to be fixed. After the speech, Martin Luther King and many other blacks were ecstatic that they had finally been able to make Kennedy come around after starting from such a low base 2.5 years earlier.
Thank you. All right, well, thank you all three for introducing your books. I've got a few questions that I want to throw at all three of you, and then we will, for the last few minutes, open it up to questions from the audience. So as things are popping into your head as you're listening, get ready, and we will carve out a few minutes at the end. I want to start with a political question, and I guess I'll aim this at Steve and Tom, since your books have more of a political slant. It is fascinating to me as a reporter in Washington today, covering politics, covering national security, how often JFK still comes up in conversation. You know, whether you're talking about secret back channels to the Kremlin, which RFK was known to meet many times with that Soviet intelligence agent, or you're talking about President Trump bringing members of his immediate family into the administration, which of course was a path well trod already by the Kennedys. My question to you would be, would the Kennedy brand of politics work in Washington today? Would it translate?
You do that one.
Tom.
Thanks, Steve. I got a laugh at the Kennedy Library this spring during the Centennial Week when it was first published, saying that there's a direct line from what John Kennedy did between 1955 and 1960 and Donald Trump. Trump is not even imaginable without Kennedy. And that's because, in effect, on the fly, Kennedy invented modern politics. All the elements of it, the media type, the TV commercials, polling, the outside-in approach to organizing, where you're not thinking of a national convention as an affair where big shots and powerful people broker nominations. You're seeing it as the culmination of a process in which, starting in 1960, politicians began to sort of let this new group of people into the process called voters. And so that's one reason. And people in national politics today, if you're starting out a campaign, there's always somebody in the office who has encyclopedic knowledge of Kennedy's victory.
Well, and
it's
one of the
still
things,
studied.
It's true. It's true, still studied today. And I was struck reading your book by your description of Kennedy's campaign as this bold, outsider, insurgent campaign that managed to exasperate and defy the party establishment. And I wondered, I mean, you were writing this during the 2016 campaign.
Well, it
very
is,
different candidate at different times.
It's very hard to think of, because of all that happened subsequently, it's hard to think of him for what he was at the time. But he was a nobody. He was very young. His resume was extremely thin. His connections to what we would call the Democratic Party were extremely tenuous at best. Everything had to be built from the ground up. That is the story of his political career. It was true when he ran for Congress in 1946, as well as when he was running for president in 1960. And as a result, because this new kind of politics really was born with his candidacy, people still understand how important it is to study it. But it makes me think of a question maybe Kathy can help me with, and that is, did she, from talking to her, did she hate this game or love it?
I think she loved it.
Why?
Because she was.
Put your mic back up so we can hear you.
I think she loved it because she was always out there to help the president and Bobby Kennedy.
Steve, how about you? As you were researching and writing, were there through lines that you were seeing parallels that apply to today?
Well, what I would say in terms of the relevance of this story of Kennedy and King today is this, that civil rights progress is never over. Civil rights progress moves forward and gets thrown back. It happened during the brief time that I looked at the progress in 61 to 63. There's two examples in the book. One is that night that John Kennedy made that transformative speech, June 11, 1963, was the same night that Medgar Evers, an NAACP worker in Jackson, Mississippi, came home and was excited about the speech as well. But as he was crossing the driveway of his home, he was gunned down. So we had elation and tragedy. The same thing sort of happened after the March on Washington in August of '63. March on Washington was a wonderful event. The civil rights movement was overjoyed by how it occurred peacefully. Martin Luther King gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. Everything went beautifully. And then a couple weeks later, we had another terrible event, a 16th Street Baptist Church bombing in Birmingham that killed 4 little girls. So the progress goes forward, it gets struck back. You could flip it all the way to today to see some of the relevance. We had a black president, and we thought we were entering a post-racial world. Well, we've had a backlash again, as we all know, since that time, and a rise of white supremacists and violence. So really the issue to take away from all of this is that this progress is delicate and it needs to be protected.
Quick point, and then I want to bring Kathy in.
I kept running into still another element of this, Steve, and that is that in great movements like civil rights, you always have to remember there's a moral track, the movement, and there's a political track, kind of get things done. And of course, in my research, Kennedy is all politics until he becomes president. But what fascinated me about your work, maybe you could talk about it just a little bit, is that Dr. King was not above politics completely. And I'm thinking especially of his reluctance to get busted at Rich's department store in Atlanta almost on the final weekend of the campaign in 1960, because he was worried about the impact that would have on the election.
Right. But he did.
He did, yeah.
I mean, he played politics because he knew he had to play politics. And he got arrested for joining in a sit-in right before the election, a couple weeks before the election. And that really, in some ways, turned the election to Kennedy, because both the candidates, Richard Nixon and John Kennedy, came under pressure to speak out about Martin Luther King's arrest. Well, the Nixon campaign offered a no comment, and that was it. John Kennedy, through various machinations with his family and his team, decided that he wouldn't speak out directly, but he would make a call to Coretta, Martin Luther King's wife, and just tell her how concerned he was about Martin Luther King and about Coretta, because she was 4 months pregnant. And that, of course, got into the media, and that rallied the black constituency, and they flocked to the polls when election time came. And after that, they claimed, and with some validity, that they elected John Kennedy, and they expected him to work for him when he was in the White House. Yeah. And that's what caused so much frustration and anger once he was in there, and he moved so slowly.
Let me ask, if I may, I just want to there's a story I want Kathy to tell us before we open it up to audience questions. And it's about the challenge that is no doubt familiar to all three of you, writing history, writing memoir, which is that we all know how the story ends. There was a moment, Kathy, in your book that so touched me, where you were asked a question that I think everybody of a certain age in America has been asked, which is, where were you when Kennedy was shot? And in your case, you write about being asked that question by his daughter, by Caroline Kennedy. What happened?
I was asked that question by Caroline in her bedroom. She says, Kat, where were you when my father was shot? And I said, I was in Ireland. And she said, I thought you were in the United States. I said, no, I was in Ireland. And I said, everybody in Ireland was very, very sad what happened to your father. And my mom, there was a picture in the Sunday's paper, a colored picture in the middle of the paper, and my mom cut it out. She got a frame, she put it into it, she hung it up in the kitchen in the middle between the Pope and the Sacred Heart and President Kennedy. And it was there for years, but it's not there anymore. I think it fell out of the frame, you know. Yeah. It was just a newspaper picture.
You know,
and Caroline was really, really shocked that I was in Ireland, and I told her that I was going to a dance, and we were all dressed up. We went to a little store to get some gum, and the lady in the store said, Kat, there is no dance tonight. And I said, why? She said, the President of the United States was shot. Everything is cancelled. Everything is closed down.
And you wrote about being able to listen to the funeral on the radio in your home now.
Yes, yes. I listened to the funeral on the radio. We had one radio, and it was a battery radio, and it had to be charged maybe every week, because it would die out. And my father used to keep it for football games. And we listened to her on the radio, and we could hear the horses' hooves going up and down the street, walking on the cobblestones.
Oh.
Yeah,
I know you want to get a word in, but I want to make sure we have time for a couple of questions and then get you to your signings on time. So if you have questions, you'll see mics. There's one on each side here. You can make your way forward. If you would tell us your name, if you have an affiliation you want to share, and if you could keep your question short and keep it a question, I would be grateful. Thank you. Please, sir.
Hi. Thank you for being here. John Kennedy.
Bringing the mic to you. There we go.
John Kennedy remains my hero. This question, I guess, is for Mr. Oliphant, but it can be addressed to all three of you. One of the things I always find fascinating about President Kennedy, or even Senator Kennedy as well, was his self-effacing humor. Whether it was during his various speeches, he seemed to always extemporaneously come out with some type of humorous remark about himself, like I said, in his self-effacing way. And I find that in today's politics or political world vastly different, of a vastly different aspect. And I was wondering if you could share that aspect of not only Senator Kennedy, but President Kennedy as well.
Humor is a political
One of the things that I thought was a gas during the 3 years of poring over research materials before Curtis Wilkie and I started writing is what an interesting politician Kennedy was. And everything applied, including humor. And as a matter of almost political strategy, he used humor to deal with two issues that were problems from the beginning of his political career in 1946 until he died. One was his family's wealth. And one of they called them openers in Kennedy's speeches, that he used all the time. He almost never talked about his wealth seriously. It was always humorously. And he said it was when he was running for the Senate against Henry Cabot Lodge in 1952, and he said he'd been talking to his father about what it would cost, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Kennedy was also already appearing to be ahead in the race, and the question was how much more to invest down the stretch. And Kennedy would say to audiences, so my father said to me, he said, look, I am willing to pay for your victory, but I'll be damned if I'm going to buy a landslide. And the other topic that occasioned humor as much as serious talk was his religion. You know, he was about to become the first and only Catholic to be elected president of the United States. And humor helped him get into the topic. And at political dinners especially, he used to tell a story about Al Smith's candidacy in 1928, the first Catholic nominee who had trouble. He said the campaign unfolded, the election occurred, Smith lost, and the day after the election, he sent a one-word telegram to Pope Pius XI, unpack.
Unpack. Very good. We've got one over here. Yes, sir.
Hi. I was wondering how much truth there was to the theories that the election was stolen for Kennedy.
Was the election stolen?
Let me pick up on something Steve said, first of all, because it's very important. There hasn't been a lot of serious studies of the vote, but a couple that we found buttress this point about the importance of African American votes at the end. There's a little story attached to that too, because unbeknownst to John and Robert Kennedy, the liberals in his office arranged to have Kennedy's intervention in the King case publicized. And they printed at least 1 million, maybe a lot more, of a 2-page leaflet that had Kennedy's activism on one side and Nixon's no comment and Eisenhower's no comment on the other, and distributed them in churches all over the country the weekend before the election. The paper was tinted blue, and they called them blue bombs. And if you study the vote, you can see the spike in the turnout in Michigan, in New York, in New Jersey, upwards of 10 states. Eisenhower himself thought that Kennedy's intervention had won him the election. The Republican National Chairman that year, later Senator and Interior Secretary Thurston Morton of Kentucky, was positive that's what did it. And so wanted to make that point, first of all. Secondly, we studied very hard Illinois and Texas. And very quickly, it's interesting to me that after all these years, the same counties and the same precincts are cited and nothing else. It's an evidentiary burden that the advocates of a fix have yet to satisfy.
Steve, you want to jump in?
Well, the only thing I would say along those lines is that the black voters did turn out in huge numbers, and I looked at some of the numbers myself as well, and certain states, I can't remember which, but it was such a close election that Kennedy eked by several thousand votes in some states, but there were 200,000 African Americans who turned out. So they clearly turned the tide in several states. And after the election was over, the African American leaders said that they believed that the black vote was responsible for more than 100 electoral votes. It was 100 and something. So that hasn't been disproved yet. So I guess we'd have to say that it's pretty accurate.
Can I just do 3 numbers real fast?
Real short numbers.
In 20 of the states that night in 1960, the margin was below 5 percentage points. And only North Carolina was 4 to 5 points. All the others were below 4%. And Kennedy won 13 of them. And in 5, his margin was less than 1%.
Yeah.
So I think we've got a very strong case.
Yeah.
There we go. All right. Yes, sir. You get the last question.
Okay. Thank you very much. Well, I'm British. Kennedy, John Kennedy was indeed an inspiration to me. And in fact, in the UK, a memorial scholarship was created in his name. And it was that scholarship that brought me to the States, where I've spent the rest of my professional life. But what I was very struck by his morality and his sense of politics, first of all with respect to civil rights, but then there was another event that nobody's mentioned, and I wonder if you have any comments, and that was Cuba, and what he did at that moment and in that crisis. I think that's also extremely important. Thank you.
I think maybe a little bit outside the scope of all 3 of your books.
Actually,
all right, we got a bite.
Cuba?
Cuba.
Is that what you said?
Cuba and the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yeah. Cuba got Kennedy into a big mess, and he listened to his advisors when he probably shouldn't have, and he was devastated by what happened on the invasion.
The October crisis. The October crisis.
Oh, the October crisis.
Yes.
Yeah, that's something different. It is a bit out of my depth, I think. So I think we need to.
let me just try very briefly one point, and that is that I think his astonishing still behavior during the missile crisis. I mean, the part I want to know, and I talked to a friend at Harvard who's beginning the next big biography of Kennedy. I want to find the kid deep in the bowels of the Pentagon who, when they were searching for something other than the alternative of war or appeasement, who found the blockade idea. Because that's Kennedy at his best. Experimental, looking for things that nobody's thought of, that's him. But I'll tell you, the missile crisis in some way is the cost of his having been too political about Cuba earlier. We've found Lou Harris Poll. I mean, it happened in civil rights too. Polls were driving a lot of what he did. But on Cuba, after the third debate with Nixon, where Nixon was doing better, particularly on a couple of foreign policy issues, Lou Harris is the first guy to be a full-time pollster on a presidential campaign, in his analysis after the debate, based on polling, said that the issue that really has America exercised right now is not the Soviet Union, it's Cuba. And that immediately led to some truculent rhetoric on Kennedy's part that I think helped lay the basis for the Bay of Pigs, which in turn laid the basis for those hideous 13 days in 1962.
Fascinating. So many stories that we could tell up here. I want to thank all three of you, Steve, Kathy, Tom. Thank you. Fascinating perspectives on the campaign and the civil rights movement and on the personal lives of this extraordinary family. Thank you all, and enjoy your day, enjoy the book festival. Thanks for coming.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.